Okay, everybody. I would like to welcome you all this evening. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for clapping for the welcome back. It was a little anemic, but I'll take it. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for this evening's plenary session, capping off a marvelous day of conversation. Last night I mentioned the rich legacy of the fall conference that we at the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture received from our founding director, David Solomon. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge David, who is with us here tonight, and to thank him for the vision and for the spirit of hospitality that has served as a model of true friendship for so many who've gathered for this fall conference over the past 20 years. Thank you, David. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome a profound theologian and thoughtful friend of the center and of many of us here, Stanley Hauerwas. Stanley is the Gilbert T. Rowe Professor Emeritus with joint appointments at Duke Divinity School and Duke Law School. In 2014, he was appointed to a chair in theological ethics at the University of Aberdeen. Before moving to Duke and Aberdeen, he taught here at Notre Dame in the theology department, and before that at Augustana College in Illinois. Born in Dallas, Texas, he earned his Bachelor of Arts at Southwestern University and his Bachelor of Divinity, Master of Arts, Master of Philosophy, and Doctor of Philosophy degrees from Yale University. Like the DeNicola Center's Fall Conference, Stanley's work cuts across disciplinary lines as he is in conversation with systematic theology, philosophical theology and ethics, political theory, as well as the philosophy of social science and medical ethics. He has delved deeply into virtue ethics over the years, citing Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue as an inspiration for his own work. Stanley delivered the prestigious Gifford Lectures at the University of St. Andrews in 2000-2001, speaking on the theme, The Grain of the Universe. A prolific writer, Stanley has published more than 51 books, in addition to many of them collections of essays, in addition to several edited volumes. In 2001, he was named America's Best Theologian by Time Magazine, to which he responded, "Best is not a theological category." Tonight, Stanley is going to speak to us on a theme that Archbishop Gujak touched upon last evening in his opening keynote, the deep lessons of friendship learned in living with persons with disabilities. His talk is entitled, "To Be Befriended, a Meditation on Friendship with the Disabled." Ladies and gentlemen, Stanley Hauerwas.
It's good to be back. When Carter suggested this topic, I thought I would have something to say that would be fairly direct. And then I discovered it's really a difficult issue. And so I ask you to enter into the difficulties with me. In the communities of L'Arche, we live and journey together. Men and women with disabilities and those who feel called to share their lives with them. We are all learning the pain and joy of community life, where the weakest members open hearts to compassion and lead us into deeper union with Jesus. We are learning to befriend them, and through and with them, to befriend Jesus. Jean Vanier begins his book, Befriending the Stranger, with these familiar reflections, at least familiar for anyone who has read Vanier. To hear or read Vanier describe his friendships with the core members of his community is to be persuaded that he is describing surely friendship, but that he is so persuasive can make us miss the challenge entailed by the attempt to describe what it means to be befriended by people who are intellectually disabled. What follows is my attempt to provide examples that describe what such friendships might look like. In the process, what we mean by friendship may be transformed. This is a tricky matter. To say to say I begin with examples seems to be an attempt to avoid accounts of friendship that in principle call into question the possibility that the relationship between the intellectually disabled and those that are not can be called friendship. So I'm trying to let an account of friendship emerge from examples, but the examples I use were chosen because I'm presupposing a prior account of friendship that does not depend on examples. The very descriptions we use to describe those who are intellectually disabled is, of course, part of the problem. As Brian Brock argues in his moving book, Wondrously Wounded, Theology, Disability, and the Body of Christ, the very descriptions, disability, invariably smothers the relationships that are essential for genuine human love and friendship. At the very least, Brock suggests we use the description people who carry the label disabled as an alternative to the unhappy description intellectually disabled. He does so because, as he points out, that ironically, those who are severely intellectually disabled do not struggle with their disability because they're wondrously free from pondering what others suppose them to lack. Brock is challenging the presumption that those who are labeled intellectually disabled suffer from being intellectually disabled. They suffer from the attitudes and behaviors of those who imagine how they would feel if they were intellectually disabled. In short, we project on the disabled how we think we would regard our lives if we were them. We do so, however, as a people who are not disabled. Thus, the sentiment seldom said, but often presupposed, I would rather be dead rather than be X or Y. But because people who are mentally disabled are not people other than who they are, and accordingly can and do enjoy who they are. Often present but unacknowledged is the role of fear in the relationship between persons of intellectual disability and those not so disabled. We are fragile creatures whose vulnerabilities produce fears that make our being befriended by the disabled frightening. Such fears do not go away even if we have been befriended by the disabled. That is why, as I will suggest, that friendship must be communal, because only a community who is made of those aware of their limits can create the peaceful space for all to flourish, disabled and abled alike. There is also the problem that Hans Reinders identifies in his important book, Receiving the Gift of Friendship, Profound Disability, Theological Anthropology, and Ethics. We often assume the profoundly disabled will be cared for because by doing so, those providing the care become better people. Reinders argues that such a justification is perverse because it is a denial that we, that is, each of us, receive our lives as gifts. No human can merit a greater humanity for herself, according to Reinders, and it is dangerous to suppose otherwise. We can become more human, but we cannot become better human beings. The difference hangs on whether we receive our lives as gifts. Whether disabled or abled, we receive our humanity from the posture of reception, and from that our human nature springs. We don't start being human, we become human. Brock argues that this way of describing people who are intellectually disabled is entailed by a theological perspective. He observes that Christian communities often offer rival understanding of the roles and gifts of those called to be church. We should not be surprised, therefore, that the disabled have a role to play in God's story of his people. Brock's book is an extended exercise to perform that project by focusing on Brian's Down syndrome autistic 16-year-old son, Adam. Brock understands his task to witness to Adam's witness by telling stories of what it means for Adam to be wondrously wounded. Brock is admirably clear that his argument is theologically all the way down. Accordingly, he understands the Christian gospel to offer a way of life that enables our ability to live as vulnerable beings who have made peace with our limits and are able to delight in the unexpected. Such a way of life can be joyous and free because we seek no longer to be gods, but to be content to be creatures whose flourishing does not mean we will not suffer. But as the stories of scriptures often make clear, it is through suffering and vulnerability that we discover our place in God's story. Brock's argument is straightforward. He suggests if we are to receive the friendship God offers us in the gift of people with intellectual disabilities, our understanding of friendship will necessarily be enriched. Also at stake will be what we mean when we say God may be rethought. Or perhaps better put, we may discover the radical implications of what we've been saying when we have been saying God. It is hard not to sense the work of Karl Barth informing Brock's proposals. What can I possibly mean by reference to Barth? I couldn't come to Notre Dame without laying Barth on you. I gotta say. So much for nature, qua nature. What could I possibly mean by referencing Barth? Just this, that Barth's anthropology is Christological, which means to be human is determined first and foremost by the relationship that exists between God and each creature. A reminder that to be a human being is to be creature. Joan O'Donovan rightly draws out the implications of Barth's position by observing that Barth was the champion of those individual beings at the border of human life. The unborn child, the severely defective infant, the very old and senile, the comatose patient. I think that my own view is that if in 100 years Christians are identified as those people who do not kill their children or their elderly, we will have done a pretty good job. But that's the challenge. Whatever one may think of Barth, it remains the case that most assume that friendship is not possible between people who are intellectually disabled and those who are not. It is hard to overcome the presumption that friendship in the most basic sense names a relation between people in which there is a reciprocal concern for the welfare of the other, and it is assumed that those who bear the label of being mentally disabled lack the agency of such a relation. This is compounded by the challenge of the unequal power relations between mentally disabled and those that care for them. In his attempt to give an account of friendship that is lasting, Aristotle argued that a kind of equality is constituted by the virtue that shapes each of the partners in a friendship is required. That condition, that is, the demand for an equality of virtue, that condition seems to make impossible friendship between people that are intellectually disabled and those that are not. Vanier and L'Arche, as the passage with which I began intimates, challenges that judgment. Crucial for sustaining that challenge is the presumption that the task our assistants in L'Arche homes is to learn to be with rather than to do for those who are dependent on others. L'Arche is based on the presumption that the desires and wishes of core members have the priority, but it is nonetheless remains unclear how such a transformation makes possible friendship between the assistants and the core members. For those who haven't been to a L'Arche home, core members are those that are mentally disabled and have other disabilities. The assistants are those who come to be with those who have such disability. Vanier's friendships, however, with the core members with whom he lives stands as a stark reminder that friendship between people who are intellectually disabled and those that are not is an actual reality. How to account for it? The question is how to describe and account for that reality. It is that task to which I now turn by holding up examples. How many of you have been to L'Arche? I mean, spread the word. I mean, Jean, of course, recently died, and it is, I don't know where we would be without such witnesses today. It's remarkable. James McAvoy has provided an account of friendship that I hope to show helps us to see how friendship between people who are intellectually disabled and those who are not is possible. According to McAvoy, quote, dialogue is intrinsic to friendship because behind the dialogue of friends lies the natural aspiration to share the same world and to build upon it in the same hopes, to share the same world. The emphasis upon communication may seem odd for an account of friendship with those who may not be for those who may be limited by their speech. But as I hope to show, the body speaks eloquently. We are people that are intellectually disabled and those who are not. We are bodily beings who share vulnerabilities that make us storied creatures. Our bodies can be storied by friendships that are constitutive of the relationships that characterize the narratives that we call our lives. The telling of stories to one another turns out to be a crucial activity for the making and sustaining friendships because it is through stories we're able to recognize what it means to live a common but a complex reality. What this might mean has been displayed by Patrick McInerney. McInerney is an English anthropologist who lived for 15 months in a L'Arche home in what he describes as a minor English city. I didn't know there was any others, but... McInerney begins his paper, which is tellingly entitled, Receiving the Gift of Cognitive Disabilities, Recognizing Agency in the Limits of the Rational Subject. He calls attention to Peter Singer's argument that those who are mentally disabled lack the ability to be autonomous moral agents. Singer draws the conclusion that the intellectually disabled can or should only have limited moral worth to others. McInerney notes that Eva Kittay has countered Singer's views by observing that people can learn to value others even if they are observing that people can learn to value if they are incapable of giving back. Though McInerney thinks Kittay's response is strong, he thinks it is not sufficiently for the agency the intellectually disabled, in fact, have. McInerney argues against Singer that while the core members in a L'Arche home may not be autonomous moral agents, they have an agency that often is not recognized because we fail to understand the different way they inhabit the world. McInerney suggests that the difference was recognized by Vanier, who began assuming that living with the intellectually disabled was a religious duty, but discovered that he had become friends with those with whom he lived. In short, Vanier had discovered they shared a common world. Vanier was kind of at loose ends, and he had a priest who was giving him directions, and he said, go live with those 3 mentally handicapped men. And Vanier, being a good Canadian, did what a French priest told him to do. And the rest is history. McInerney observes that Vanier's assumptions about disability and vulnerability meant he could no longer see those with whom he lived as problems. Neediness turned out to be a source of life-giving relationship. McInerney, who has a theological background, observes that once Vanier ceased being afraid of his vulnerability, he rightly began to understand that God comes to us not in our strengths, but often in our weaknesses. McInerney confesses that he began his work in L'Arche with a presumption not unlike Vanier had at the beginning of being with the men with whom he had been charged to live. That is, McInerney confesses he began with the assumption that the young women he encountered who were described as intellectually disabled were passive dependents without agency. Such presumptions were reinforced by his first encounters with core members of the home in which McInerney was to live. There he encountered Rachel, who was making random hand gestures, Sarah rolling herself around and around in her wheelchair, and Martha, who spoke constantly but did not seem to make sense. McInerney assumed such women were incapable of active engagement with the world. He came to see these young women, however, in a very different light. He discovered they were exercising agency, but in a very different kind than that assumed by those of us who think we are in control of our lives. He recognized the agency of the core members required training that comes from learning at the core members as the core members must learn. That is, that the essential dependent character of our lives does not mean we are without agency. Such agency begins with the acknowledgement of vulnerability, interestingly enough. Such acknowledgement entails exercises such as asking the assistants to recognize their dependence on others. That requires training if they are to discover the many ways they have relied on others to live out the gifts that have made their lives possible. Those insights are tested by their being asked to reflect on the sheer difficulty of helping a core member shower and dress in the morning. The difficulty of providing such help can serve to create in assistance the vulnerability that the core members cannot help but embody. McInerney quotes one of the experienced assistants' observation that L'Arche was never about helping them. There may be differences in our cognitive abilities, but no difference at all in our shared humanity. I mean, what L'Arche shows, if you've come to a L'Arche home to make it work, you'll burn out pretty soon. Stories about the relation of assistants and core members are crucial for the development of friendships. Meals often provide the context for the telling and retelling of stories about core members, as well as stories told by core members. I mean, if you've ever been to a large home, birthdays are everything, and they celebrate birthdays with great joy, and you're never to miss one. For example, McInerney gives the example, for example, of Maria, a long-term assistant who told the story of her early confrontation with Sarah, who could not verbally communicate. Maria was given the task of helping Sarah take a bath in the morning. This was no easy task. Maria confesses she did not know what she was doing, but she assumed that neither did Sarah know what she was doing. Finally, however, after some time, Maria figured how to help Sarah bathe herself. She reports addressing Sarah directly, saying to Sarah, "And you just sat there very patiently and quietly, letting me make error after error. When I finally worked out what the right thing to do was, you looked at me dead in the eye, and then you laughed at me." McInerney reports that such stories, which are often told many times, serve to challenge the preconceptions that assistants cannot help but bring to their work. For the stories are often told by the core members in a manner that makes them active subjects, capable of authoring actions that affect others. Through these exchanges, the core members' gifts of the heart are discovered. Among those gifts is the keen insight that those that care for them. Raina, a very experienced assistant, told McInerney, "You cannot hide your personality from people with learning disabilities. You have to open yourself up. They find your weaknesses and strengths very quickly, and that confronts you with your own disabilities and inabilities." McInerney reports on the importance of the language of gift to describe the core members. In particular, McInerney suggests one of the aspects of the gift names in the core members is a kind of unusual honesty. Hillary, one of the assistants, describes Sarah, for example, smiling and enjoying herself as she looks at herself in a full-length mirror. Sarah smiles because she thinks she looks wonderful in the mirror. Hillary reports she is far too self-conscious to smile at herself, that is, the assistant, to smile at herself while looking in the mirror, as she does. She would be too afraid, that is, the assistant would be too afraid that others would find her behavior narcissistic and too self-involved. But Hillary says Sarah can look at the mirror over and over again with herself swinging in front of the mirror back and forth because, quote, "Sarah really loves herself and she helps me to start loving myself." I mean, there's no second consciousness. You can just see Sarah enjoying Sarah in the mirror. Sarah's gift of joy, reflected by her image in the mirror, is, according to McInerney, the source of a particular kind of agency that is easily overlooked. Sarah and the other women in the L'Arche home have the gift, quote, of ignoring the judgments of others and loving themselves. Because they are core members are incapable of embodying some of the social and moral ideals that characterize the life of those of us that are cognitive able. They are particularly perceptive and honest. Sarah and her friends do not recognize that looking into a mirror and smiling at themselves might make them appear self-obsessed. Yet because they are not afraid of being so understood, they bring a spontaneity to their life that makes their friendships available and possible. McInerney observes that the descriptions of agency he has tried to provide reveals the paucity of our existing language for describing the possibility in terms of agency other than that assumed by people like Singer. McInerney, however, directs attention to Veena Das, an anthropologist of ethics, who provides a different understanding of self and ethics. Das argues ethics is not so much about the technologies of self-making as it is an attentiveness through which one ties one's own fate to the fate of the other. Ethics, so understood, means the moral life is not constituted by cognitive activity, but rather is, according to Das, an attitude of the soul, a phrase she learned from Wittgenstein. McInerney draws on Das's account to suggest that training in L'Arche teaches the assistants to see the intellectual disabilities of those whom they live not as impediments, but as they're acting morally, but as enabling aspects of ethical attention that is charismatic. Their lives have more in common with unruly saints of the church, according to McInerney, than to the rational agents such as Peter Singer assumes. Those who have learned to be their friends with people like Sarah, value the way they transgress assumed norms of behavior and express the value of a liminal community. McInerney's stories are sufficient to sustain the point I'm trying to make, but I cannot resist providing a brief account of Adam by his father that I referred to earlier. I cannot resist not only because Brock's account is theologically astute, but it is also the case I'm Adam's godfather. I hope to say just enough to tempt you to read Brian Brock's book. Brock wants us to see Adam as he has learned to see and live with Adam. Such a scene entails a theological discipline in which we learn to use well the word God. For as Brock argues, God is not an idea or essence that can be extracted from events, but God is a name revealed in the drawing of a people into a congregation. They have been called out of the world that is organized by other names that refuse to acknowledge that the human life is a gift from God. Adam, Down syndrome, and autistic is such a gift. Brock makes the striking observation that if the kingdom brought by Jesus is shalom, then Adam may be the healthiest person he knows. Adam is able to live without a worry about the future. Second, there is no gap between what Adam says and what Adam does. He simply cannot lie, even though he communicates through the body. When Adam puts his hand on a visitor's mouth, he is genuinely wishing them a good hello. He is, moreover, emotionally sensitive, often breaking into tears when his parents and brother and sister argue. He is, moreover, constant in his enjoyment of his family. These are hard-won insights about Adam by his father and his mother. For Adam to survive has taken extraordinary sacrifice and tried the patience of Brian and Stephanie. Yet Brock is surely right to suggest that when he is with Adam, he cannot forget how different and beautiful the social world is to which he is a witness. Adam is content to be a creature who is able to inhabit a time and place that challenges the surrounding culture. Surely one cannot help but desire to have a friend like Adam. And Adam is a Christian. He is sure during worship he's meant to walk to the center of the church, the cathedral at Aberdeen called St. Andrew's. He is to take off his shoes and socks, all the while rocking back and forth, swinging something repetitively in his hand and gutturally vocalizing, all the while sitting at the feet of the priest. His father observes Adam ensures that St. Andrew's is not a church for anyone who thinks in worship you must always be quiet. Recently, on his 15th birthday, Adam was confirmed. Brock includes in his description of Adam's confirmation a letter I wrote celebration of that event. I wrote, "I only wish I could be there to witness, Adam, your becoming a stalwart of the church." I put the matter that way because confirmation means the church will depend on you to be fully embodied in Christ. These matters are tricky because you have for some time represented Christ for the church through your dancing. Some may say that is a strange description of your presence in worship because you just cannot be still. But I have always thought when I've been with you in worship that you are dancing to the music of God's angels, made as they are to glorify God. My hunch is you were granted the grace to be closer to those wonderful creatures than those of us who are identified as normal and grown up. So on this wonderful day, dance for the gathered body of believers, because we all need the joy that animates your movements. I finally come back to Vanier and the passage with which I began. One of the dangers Vanier's work represents is Vanier's prose can invite the presumption that he's far too pious and unrealistic. So when Jean writes, we all need to cleanse our lives and our loves for Jesus, hidden in those who are often unwanted, the temptation is to read these thoughts in a sentimental fashion. Yet as I suggested above, there's nothing sentimental about Vanier. The high humanism that shapes many views of the disabled is absent in Vanier because he does not engage in false stories about his friends. He knows his friends can be unbelievably difficult. Their demands will not allow sentimental claims about innocence. In his book, Reconsidering Intellectual Disability, Jason Reimer Grieg has developed the most complex and complete account we have of Jean Vanier's understanding of L'Arche as a school for friendship. Grieg rightly argues that Christian friendship and the description Christian he rightly assumes appropriate for Vanier's understanding of friendship is not simply an interpersonal affair, but is first and foremost a communal moral endeavor. No rite embodies that communal aspect of friendship more fully, according to Grieg, than foot washing. To have one's feet washed by a core member joins the bodily and social practice that makes friendship in L'Arche between core members and assistants possible. We all want to wash the feet of the disabled. Are we ready to have the disabled wash our feet? That's the crucial move. The thick analysis Grieg provides of friendship and in particular of the role of the body in L'Arche homes, is confirmed by a story Vanier tells about a core member named Eric. In his commentary on the Gospel of John, Vanier has come to know Eric. It says he's come to know Eric during a year when he was on sabbatical and living in the home for the profoundly disabled. So Eric and Vanier ended up in the same place. Eric had arrived at L'Arche when he was 16. The local hospital, a psychiatric hospital, would no longer care for him. He was blind, deaf, and he could not speak. He was not toilet trained. Vanier confesses he had never seen so much anguish in one person, particularly one so young. Reflecting on Vanier, Eric observes that many that come to L'Arche have a broken self-image. In particular, they sense they have been a disappointment for their parents, who they sense do not want them because they are disabled. They cannot help but conclude they are without value, and even more destructive, they draw the conclusion they are not lovable. L'Arche is the way Vanier discovered that by welcoming the stranger as a potential friend, though they are in terrible pain, they discover they are able to hear the pain because they are valued and made beautiful by being cared for by friends. Eric proved, however, to be a deep challenge. What it might mean to Eric to be loved simply did not seem to be possible. Vanier, however, was not deterred. Though Eric could not see or hear, Vanier was sure he could be touched. That is what they did. Day after day, they held and washed his body with respect and love. Slowly but surely, they were able to communicate with him, and he communicated with them. He was able to be befriended because he had been befriended. Vanier comments on this transition by suggesting what Jesus commands us to do is to be befriended by the weak, those in need, the lonely. For when the poor, the weak, and the lonely claim us as friends, they prevent us from falling into the trap of power, especially the power to do good. To be befriended by the poor and the disabled saves us from the presumption we must save the Savior and the church. To accept our own poverty, to become vulnerable by being befriended by those who are filled with need, makes this prayer possible. Dear God, I cannot do this on my own. I need your help. I suspect some may find Vanier's relationship with Eric remarkable, but there's no reason to describe their relation as a friendship. Yet given McAvoy's account of friendship as sharing a common world, I think it's not unreasonable to accept Vanier's description of his relation with Eric as friendship, which is but a reminder that friendship comes in many different shapes and sizes. Surely, moreover, it is the case that the relation of Eric and Vanier is not as strange as Thomas Aquinas maintains God's desire to have us as friends. According to Thomas, charity, God's unrelenting desire to have and be loved by us, makes possible a certain friendship with him. For God, like Sarah, McInerney observes, loves and is loved because God delights in the love that created us to be us. Such love transforms what Thomas identifies as servile fear into filial fear, which only fears losing our friendship with God. A fear that makes us no longer servants, but friends with the one who alone is capable of transforming our vulnerabilities into love. Friendship has always been a major theme in my work, but more important, in my life. So I need to close with a brief remark. In 1970, I was hired to teach theological ethics at a school called Notre Dame. I had no idea what I was getting into, and I'm sure I made many mistakes knowing nothing about Catholicism. But the people at Notre Dame befriended me, a loose cannon Protestant, and in the process taught me how to be befriended and to befriend, which is but my way to say thank you. Thank you very much.
Friends, we have microphones up front. If you would like to ask a question, please come forward.
You're right, I was right.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was especially touched by it because I'm currently doing my senior thesis critiquing some of Peter Singer's ideas on personhood. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I thought it was very wonderful that we can observe certain moral agency in those that we would describe with intellectual disability. So how would you talk about friendship for those who we might not be able to observe any sort of moral exercise, or for example, the unborn and those who we can't really communicate with necessarily?
When I lived in South Bend, I was on the Protective Service Board for the Council of the Mentally Handicapped. And Protective Service is where you are ready as a committee of the National Association of Retarded Citizens to take responsibility for a court remanding the child to your care. And we had a social worker. And her name is Bonita Rainey, and she did her PhD at Notre Dame. And we would go to Cardinal Nursing Home, and they would, it was more a warehouse for mentally handicapped people. If you walked into the day room, you would find a headbanger, someone sitting in their own fecal matter and so on. And you would think it would be better if these people hadn't been born. You could take those same people and put them in a home with other folk in a way that they were appropriately cared for. And you would say, this is beautiful. Bonnie, and that would create a whole different set of attitudes and behaviors. There was a young man named Boyce, and Boyce was African American. He probably was about 12. He couldn't see and he couldn't hear, and he spent most of his life on a beanbag. When you went on rounds with Bonnie, she would come in to Boyce and she would put her hand on his cheek and he would lighten up like anything. He knew it was Bonnie. Now, it takes months for those kinds of connections to be made. And Peter Singer wants to shorten time, and speed kills these fellow humans that make us part of the wider common life, which we can call friendship. That's the best I can do.
Great, thank you very
Yes.
much.
Hi, my name is David Coulter. I wrote the foreword to a book that John Swidden edited about your work some years ago. And it was, the foreword was titled A Doctor's Debt to Stanley Hauerwas. So thank you. I hope I have somehow managed to try to repay that debt in my own work. I had a question. I was listening to Professor McIntyre this afternoon, and he drew a distinction between friendship and what he called friendly relationships.
Yeah.
And the implication was that friendship requires a certain mutuality of sharing of oneself and what one believes in. And it requires the ability to sort of put yourself forward and to share that with another human being and open yourself up and tell your story. So my question is what we're talking about here a friendship or friendly relations? And let me just say a few things more. I have a patient, young, like Adam Brock, a young man with autism and Down syndrome. And I always treat him just like I would anybody else. And I try to be, as humane as I can. And one day we were in clinic, and he stopped, looked at me, took my hands, put my hands on both sides of his head, and smiled at me. And he's nonverbal. I said to his mother, "What's going on?" And she said, "That's love. That's love."
Said what?
Love.
Love, yes.
And maybe that's friendship.
I certainly want to think it's friendship. I had talked to Alistair about, I was working on this paper, and I've written it more times than I care to think about. And Alistair said, "I don't believe there can be friendship in general in our world." And in particular with the mentally disabled, and it's more like friendliness. I was trying to avoid exactly that presumption that this kind of account that I was trying to draw out of these examples is just friendliness. I think there's a profound sense of being a friend with a people of intellectual disability that requires great patience. That it turns out to be, and I didn't develop this, fun. I mean, a friendship involves fun.
Yeah.
And so that's what you see constantly in the Irish homes, is they have a hell of a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And you can't avoid that. So that's my best answer to Alistair, but he will not be impressed.
One last thing. Bill Gaventa sends his regards.
Oh, great.
I saw him on Wednesday. He said what I saw you to say.
Bill Gaventa is one of the great saints having to do with putting practices together for people to be able to interact with the mentally disabled. I do think that what I was saying, they just scare the shit out of us. And how to learn to be with people who do not respond the way we normally have habituated people to respond is part of the great challenge. Exactly, right. When I was asked to serve on the local board of ARC, I went over to Logan Center. You remember Logan Center, red brick building over here, and a little boy about 7 ran up to me, and Down syndrome kids are not angelic. They can be just as bad as anyone. But this kid came up, but they don't have senses of distance. And this kid came up and he wrapped his arms around me and put his head right. And so I was trying to show that I wasn't prejudiced in a way. But this kid was scaring me to death. And all I could think of is, how could I get him down? I learned a lot having to carry him all the way through the building.
Hi, I'm Dietrich from the University of St. Thomas. Thank you so much for coming. I've had the privilege of working with students with special needs at my high school and paraprofessionals, being a resource teacher assistant. And I'm really intrigued by the L'Arche community, and I'd like to know how the community engages the core members in prayer, whether it be a community, personally, and maybe what you've learned or the different ways in which we can learn from their prayer.
They certainly invite core members to be part of everyday liturgical action. And at Trolet in France, they will have mass in this kind of barn that they've redone, and the priest is celebrating, but while they're celebrating, usually a core member is circling the altar, singing and directing attention to themselves. They never try to say, you need to sit down. No, you don't sit down, because what you're doing is part of the way you've learned to pray. And so I think that there is a current tension that's just developing within the L'Arche movement. And that's it. Jean Vanier was a pious Roman Catholic. That just absolutely pervaded the L'Arche movement. Though, I mean, you could even be Church of England. So you didn't have to be a Roman Catholic to be part of it. But they are now having L'Arche homes in, for example, in South India, where most of the assistants are not Christian. How that transition is going to be made, I think, is part of the continuing struggle within how you understand what you're doing in L'Arche. And of course, Jean Vanier was very wise. He knew he was not long to live, and that L'Arche is a kind of monastic movement. And they brought in abbots to talk with them about how to make the transition when John dies, because they knew that you need help to make those when you've got that kind of charismatic figure in the middle. That's very, very interesting kind of developments. But that's the best I can do. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. If I could paraphrase a notion from the beginning of that, friendship might be best realized in the context of community. But I also think about the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says, where 2 or 3 are gathered, so I am there, in which 2 is a critical mass. What additional fruits are we realizing when the community is expanded? And what else can we gain from friendship in that regard?
To learn the truth about ourselves. I think that's crucial. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, I'm not sure is a text about friendship. John 19 is central. I sneakily referred to it but didn't call attention to it. I call you my friends because you're no longer servants, but you can figure out what you need to do to be my follower. I take that's central. And that's not to be a hero, it is, or a heroine, it is to be a faithful member of the church that makes possible a way of life that's otherwise unimaginable. Yes.
Hello. I have spent time living as an assistant in a large community, and in
Which
living
one?
in Seattle, Washington.
Yeah, I've been there, right.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Deeply formed and cultivated who I am today, I think. And as my time as an assistant, I would always wonder, I went to Lars to be a friend and to be befriended, and how it looked sometimes wearing multiple hats of being a caregiver and a friend, a caregiver and a housemate, and how that the boundaries can get messy and attachments can get messy, and just kind of curious of what you had to say, or McInerney, or you've heard John Vanier say about that.
What did you like? What did you dislike the most
About Lars?
about living there?
Things that were mandated to us by the state, I think.
I'm sorry?
Things that were mandated to us by the state that we had to follow, that were kind of antithetical to the mission of Lars.
Right. Yeah, that's a great dislike. If you give that answer often, you'll be called a sectarian fideistic tribalist. But it is, I think that what that nicely does is illustrate what a countercultural and counter-legal view L'Arche is. And who could have thought it up? What it means to be. I'm right, aren't I, about what sustains you is the joy of the everyday, and the hugs you get that you hadn't anticipated. That keeps you going in a way that you're not going to find it anywhere else, except possibly your mother, who turns out to be manipulating you. But there's no manipulation in the people that are hugging you. That's the best thing. Yes.
Good night. My name is Jorge. I have a question about. I have worked a little bit in charity, in like helping elder people, and sometimes you see these people, wonderful people, and sometimes inside of me I think about how the elder people is treated by society. Like sometimes they are looked like disabled, and sometimes I think what we can do, like because in my mind, I used when I was a child used to see like your grandfather, your grandmother very close to your family, so you can reach them, they can advise you, and those are things that somehow are like less. Like right now, we take care less in our society. Maybe in some places, losing when you lose an elder, it is like a great, a big loss for the community, because they carry the knowledge, they carry the experience that maybe even when you are growing up, you really don't have. So what kind, like a normal person like us, kind of give more like humanity, dignity? How can we take care about these people?
I'm not sure I understand everything that you were asking, but Sartre was right. The family's a hellhole, isolated from a community that gives it the practices necessary for the discovery of the goods you have in common. And that provides the kind of resource that makes possible the responsibility for people who didn't turn out the way we thought they should turn out. And that, in the long run, helps us embody the small acts of the everyday that makes possible our living with one another without killing one another. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.